Hello and welcome to today's video on The Emigrée by Rumens. I'm going to take you through this poem, I think, quite quickly. Previous videos I've made have told you absolutely everything you need to know about a poem, but actually you only really need 5 quotations at most for the power and conflict questions. So let's see how I do. The émigré is a French word. It means someone who's had to migrate to a different country, usually because they've been displaced. And in this poem, uh, this woman, and that's why it's got a double E ending, it's a female person, has been displaced probably through war. It's not an autobiographical poem. Carol Rumens is a Londoner born in London. She's not writing about herself. So she's writing about an imagined childhood. She's created a character. Um, and so let's look at the conflict. There are two kinds of conflict in this poem. One, where the persona, the protagonist of the poem, has been excluded from their own country, which is at war or has been at war. So there's that physical sort of conflict. And then the other conflict is a really interesting one. It's the role of memory. And the speaker of this poem realizes that their memory is idealized. It's not a real memory all the time, but they cling on to that memory nevertheless. And so we might interpret the poem also as being symbolic of all our own childhoods. When we look back on our childhood, we don't remember things exactly as they were. We remember a more idealized view. Right, let's begin the poem. There once was a country. You can see how it begins like a child's story. It's almost once upon a time. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. And so you can see how she's thinking about memory from the beginning, and it's her memory. She realizes that this might not be everyone else's memory. In fact, it probably isn't, because she keeps coming back to this motif of sunlight. A motif is an image that's repeated, and she knows this isn't real. It can't always have been in sunlight, but nevertheless to her it is, because it is a precious memory. Clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November which, I'm told, comes to the mildest city. So she can never remember it in winter. She only remembers it in mild weather. And so she realizes that this memory is idealized and not real, but she still can't get rid of it because it's so precious. And that, if you like, is a symbol for how we see our own childhoods and our own past. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright filled paperweight. So that there is a metaphor, and this metaphor is connected, as many of them will be in this poem, to paper, because she recreates this city on paper by writing this poem. So there's this kind of pun going through the whole poem. And the memory has weight, even though it's only made of paper. So there's a kind of oxymoron going on here, because the weight that is paper is actually the poem itself, because the poem encapsulates all these memories that she has. And then you've got this semantic field of sunlight again. It's a bright paperweight. She's remembering it in sunlight again. It may be at war. It may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. And so again, we've got this motif that I mentioned earlier, the positive memory, and that's juxtaposed with this violence here. Again, a metaphor of how she has been branded. Now, typically a brand is a sign of ownership that's put onto an animal's hide and it's burnt in. You've probably seen these sorts of things. So here's an image. A brand, usually in the form of a letter, is heated and burnt into the skin of the animal. So this choice of verb, branded, comes from the same semantic field, if you like, as war, in the sense that it's violent, but it's a violence of which she is actually proud, and she wants to hold on to this image. So she cannot shake off this childhood memory of this gorgeous sunlit city. even once she finds out that that city is now sick with tyrants. Again, another metaphor. Here it's personification because the city cannot be human. However, she doesn't mind that because she's not living there. She just has that memory which preserves it. In the second stanza, she frames the memory in black and white, just like print is black and white on the page. The city she remembers as white. Obviously, white is symbolic of innocence, but also of surrender. So the city has surrendered to tyrants, it's been conquered, but it's also innocent in her memory. And we can ally that innocence with the idea of it being graceful. Um, but what happens to this city? Well, the graceful slopes glow even cleaner as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us. So she knows that her memory is false. Um, so time has made the memory clearer. It's changed the facts, and she knows it's changed the facts, but she allows it to happen. And interestingly, we've got this metaphor here where time itself is like an enemy. So this metaphor gives us the impression that the city has been conquered by an army with tanks. But at the same time, she's using that description to suggest how her memories have been taken over, and that process has conquered reality. In other words, this is partly a false memory, but it's a memory that's so precious to her, it's part of her identity that she hangs on to it. And what she could be asking here is whether we're all like that, whether we all idealize our past, make it sound more perfect than it is, because it helps build our identity. Now, to an adult reader in the 20th century, when this poem is written, 1993, this description of tanks filling a city is one that would be familiar from the news. So if you go back to 1956, this is when the Russians, the Soviets, went into Hungary, and here we are in Budapest, and the tanks invaded the city as the Russians insisted that Hungary remain communist under their control. And now we jump forward to 1968, and this is the invasion of Prague in Czechoslovakia. And again, the Russian tanks come into the city because this city also wanted to get rid of Russian and communist control. And then finally, a more recent image in Peking, in Tiananmen Square. These are Chinese tanks dispersing student revolts, and this is a famous picture of one man standing on his own, facing up to all these tanks in 1989. And of course, what was really significant about 1989 is that was the year that the Soviet Union collapsed, and communism was rejected by the people, and all of those countries that had been part of the Soviet Union, dominated by Russia, achieved their independence. And this poem is just before that moment. So Rumens is imagining what it was like to experience exile from your country, not being able to go back to a free country, and having to live in our own, in the United Kingdom, as an exile, as an emigre. So now the poem changes and it becomes quite subtle with the use of the word us. So on the one level, she's saying the frontiers rise between us, that's between herself and the people she's left behind. They are us because they are her own countrymen, her own people, perhaps even members of her own family, but she can't get to them because she can't get across the border, across the frontiers. However, the poem is also written to us, an English-speaking audience, and she's at the same time suggesting that there's a frontier between herself as an emigre and the British, those of us in this country who might not particularly welcome her. Or if we do welcome her, we close upon her like waves. Now, waves here are symbolic of the gap between us and Europe, it's the English Channel, but it's also an image of drowning. And it's as though our culture, the British culture, is drowning out her old one. So she's losing her identity like somebody drowning. Again, that's a violent image of conflict, a simile, which I hope you spotted. And she's doing that to suggest that she desperately needs to hold on to that childhood memory in order not to become drowned in our own culture. Now she looks back. That child's vocabulary I carried here, like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. It may by now be a lie banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. So there you've got the motif again. The use of the senses here is a metaphor. It tastes of sunlight. Obviously, that's impossible, but that's what she's trying to say about her memory. Her memory, of course, is impossible because it isn't fully true, but it's also impossible because it is so wonderful, and that's why she needs to hold on to it. What's interesting here is she's bringing back her childhood language. This is a language that she hasn't spoken, and she's relearning it. She's learning the grammar again, and she imagines it as colours, had every coloured molecule of it. This is a really strange image. It's as though it's been completely blown apart, destroyed, but she imagines in this memory being able to take every single molecule and reassemble it. So she's relearning her language that she had as a child. This could be the actual language she spoke. Let's imagine it was Czechoslovakian, but it's also the language of childhood. She thinks like a child in terms of simple ideas and opposites, which is what you get in this poem. But there is a sense that she'd kind of like to forget some of these memories, and she can't. So in this metaphor, she says, I can't get it off my tongue. She's trying to become, in this metaphor, English, but she can't let go of her previous language. She just can't get rid of it. She has a childhood memory, and she associates this language with a doll. Well, I need two colours for that. That's a beautiful image. I'll explain it more in a minute. But we've got this almost oxymoronic hollow. So the doll is comforting, but the hollow is worrying. It suggests an emptiness inside her. So the simile itself is supposed to bring to mind this babushka doll, the sorts that fit into each other. So these are, a famous Russian symbol, if you like, and that invites us to see her country that she's left as something like Hungary or Prague. But the other violence and conflict of that image is that when she holds on to that identity and opens it up, she finds that it's actually hollow in the same way that her memory is hollow. It's not really real. So we get the idea here that she doesn't belong in the country that she's left, but also feels hollow because she doesn't belong in the country she's arrived in Britain. And now we come to the final stanza, and here the city comes to her as a poem. So this stanza is as much about being a poet as it is about her childhood memory. I have no passport. There's no way back at all, but my city comes to me in its own white plain. So here we've got that repetition of white again, of innocence, but the plain is a flat surface, and that's clearly a reference to paper. It's a white piece of paper which she fills with this poem. It's also a childish reference. We might imagine a paper plane here, and that again is an image that brings us back to her childhood games. It lies down in front of me docile as paper. And so again, that link with paper is given much more precisely here. So we know the city presents itself through this poem. And then we've got the pun on lies. So yes, it lies down, but also she's acknowledging that the memory itself is a lie even though she's got to hold on to it. That's all she has, even though she realizes it's false. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. Now, this uh, personification of the city is revealing. Again, it imagines the city as a doll which she is caressing, but this is something that a child would do. So again, it suggests she can't escape her childhood, even though she should do, or perhaps might want to. And then we've got the ambiguity of the eyes being shining. Are they shining with joy? Do they come from the same semantic field as the sunlight? Or are they shining with tears? And we can see light reflected in those tears. And that's left to us to decide. And I think she does this deliberately to kind of present the joy of the memory, but also the pain of knowing that it's an imagined memory that she can never recover, and that her childhood has gone forever, just as all our childhoods disappear forever. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. They accuse me of absence. They circle me. So here we have an image of the people in the country that she's left behind being quite hostile towards her. She has escaped and they haven't, or they have decided to stay and make the best of it, and she has abandoned them. So this shows us how she's no longer welcome in the city that she's left. Perhaps she's gone back to it and they circle her, surrounding her, not as a form of welcome, but it feels like being a threat. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. Well, now we've got a sudden leap, because we know the city isn't free, this one that she's left, because it's sick with tyrants. So what could be going on here is that they have been brainwashed to believe that their way of life is better, that they're more free. And that's a reference to the communism that happened in the Eastern Bloc. So children were brought up to believe that the communist state was a free state. It was the only fair way to live because everyone was treated equally, unlike in the capitalist system where the rich exploit the poor. On the other hand, this also might refer to the City of London, or the city that she's in the United Kingdom. So that city is free. However, as an emigre, as a foreigner, she is accused of being dark by the people who live there. And so we've got this element of racism or prejudice. Now remember, Carol Rubens is not this character. She's imagining being a character, being an emigre. My city hides behind me. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. So we might argue that she ends on this motif of sunlight to give the poem an optimistic end. It's an imagined future, imagining the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and all these countries are suddenly going to become free again. Or we might decide that actually we should focus on the shadow here, and that is a kind of foreshadowing of her own death. She's having to sacrifice herself in some way in order to remember this city as sunlight. So this is a quite convoluted image, and it suggests that her desperation to hold on to this memory has actually damaged her. She's become associated in her own mind with death. It's taking its toll on her. Or it may be a reference to her returning to this city. She, by the end of the poem, can't keep away from it, but she's been surrounded perhaps by the secret police. Maybe she's going to be arrested. Maybe she's going to be executed or disappeared or just locked up in jail. And she deliberately leaves that as ambiguous. We don't find out what actually happens to her here, or even whether she's actually traveled back to that city, or is still in the United Kingdom, imagining return that never happens. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the poem. What has the poet's purpose been? Well, she's asked us to imagine what it's like to be displaced from our home country and not in at home in our new one. This idea of not fitting in comes throughout the poem. She's tried to explore this feeling of mourning at the loss of our own childhoods. So the city then becomes a symbol of the childhood we've left behind and how we can never recapture it as adults. We can never go back over that border. And also to explore memory as a creative lie. So even though these are false memories, they nevertheless feel true and more true than reality. And that's what leads to the poetry here and this recurring motif of sunlight. So it's finally a really optimistic poem. And you're probably thinking, oh, well, that's fine, Mr. Salles, but you haven't told me anything about structure, and I need to write about structure in the exam. Well, actually, I have, because each stanza ends with the motif. That's your structural point, and explaining why that's there will get you the marks. So I have no idea whether that's been a beneficial way for you to get the poem at supersonic speed. Please let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like more, don't forget to subscribe.